G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy in the wake of the 2024 AFL draft. I thought today I would take the opportunity to have a little look at the advent of Tasmania coming around the corner, entering the competition in 2028, and considering all of the impacts that's going to have on other clubs, existing clubs, to access young talent when that happens. I envisage that process will probably start in around 2026. The 2027 draft will be the draft Tasmania has access to all of that talent, and it will be a heavily compromised draft. Looking at the previous model of Gold Coast and GWS, that sort of suggests that perhaps 2026 will also be compromised, where Tasmania might be able to pre-list teenagers. We don't know the exact way Tasmania will receive concessions, so there's a bit of speculation in this. And if you watch my 2025 draft video that I did a few days ago on this channel, I did suggest that 2025 could be the last draft that is not compromised by Tasmania. It's compromised by academies, but specifically with reference to Tasmania, 2025 looms as an important draft as well. So with that all being said, what I want to do in this video is do like a tier maker and rank teams based on how well I think they are placed for Tasmania entering the competition, with the general vibe being those who have spent the last few years hitting the draft hard and acquiring talent in preparation for Tasmania will be relatively well placed. Those teams with really good academies will be absolutely fine, you'd think. And also teams that probably, regardless of whether they've been drafting well lately, if they're likely to be contending over 2027, 2028 and beyond, then they're probably also not super vulnerable to a Tasmania entering the competition. So I suppose the teams that will be down the bottom of this tier maker will be those who have a really old age profile and haven't been hitting the draft because their time is running out a little bit. Now I want to make one thing clear. This is not meant to be a prediction of how well teams will go. In some cases, you'll have teams that rank really highly in these rankings because, they've been hitting the draft hard, but there's obviously going to be some doubt as to whether those kids come good. And if those kids don't come good and lift those teams out of the bottom of the ladder, then those teams will also be vulnerable. There's also going to be teams in here who have a horrible age profile, but we know from time and time again, they continue to be good. So it doesn't really matter. So I'm not making bold claims as to which teams are going to be screwed, but if we look at this through a talent acquisition standpoint, looking at which teams have premiership windows that end at the exact wrong time, that is the way we'll tend to look at this, and not so much making predictions. But anyway, I've rambled on enough. Let's get into this tier maker. Okay, so I've got the 5 categories. Those who are very well placed for talent, those who are probably going to be contending in that period anyway, so it's kind of irrelevant, what their talent level is or like how well they've been hitting the draft. In yellow, we've got teams who have been hitting the draft and, may or may not be contending. In orange, I've left a section there for uncertainty, and of course, as always, I will discuss those teams specifically. And then there's one team, in my opinion, who's right in the danger zone, but as I will get to, I'm sure they'll probably be fine. We'll get into it. Now, this might surprise you, but the team that I think is by far and away better placed from a talent acquisition standpoint and a list profile standpoint than anyone else is the Gold Coast Suns. And they have a Death Star as their logo. That's no sun, that's a space station. Look, I think if you consider a few things, how well they've hit the draft or how good their access to talent has been for a number of years now, and the academy that is unlikely at all to be affected by Tasmania coming into the competition, they are protected to some extent by that. And, they had 4 first-round draft picks in 2023. They're likely to have 4 more in 2025. And if you want more detail on that, I've done a video on the 2025 draft. So that, in addition with the fact that in theory, they should be contending over the next 4 years, 5 years, or however long you want to put it, they tick every box. It's probably been the best placed for a Tasmania raid. In the likely contending category, and we'll move through and put one in each, I'm going to put Fremantle. I think their age profile is rock solid. They haven't really been hitting the draft that hard. They did take Murphy Reed recently. They got a first-round draft pick. A couple of years where they missed first-rounders because they traded for Luke Jackson. But if you just look at their list profile, I think it's a very talented group that's well-rounded. And I'm not going to say they're going to be winning flags. Obviously, I would hate to see that happen as an Eagles fan. But I think, as far as being vulnerable to Tasmania, aside from Tasmania taking one of their established players, which we cannot predict at all, I'm going to say that Fremantle are very well placed for when Tasmania come into the competition by virtue of the fact they've spent a long time compiling talent, and I think they'll be deep into finals over that time frame. I'm also going to say West Coast, just to get my team out of the way, are probably in the next category down. I'm not confident enough to say they're going to be contending by then. Obviously, I hope so. It's not really the point of this video to project, when that premiership window opens for West Coast. But there has been a number of drafts in a row where they've been hitting the draft. Okay, you could say they traded down from pick 3 which was a very courageous decision. But I think if you look at the list build holistically and the fact that they've also held 2 first rounders in 2025 with some good WA talent, I don't think they're in any serious danger. I think there's many teams that are worse placed. Now, West Coast, if they capitulate and don't get any better for the next 5 years, that would be a really bad situation and they would be screwed. But generally speaking, there has been a number of years, probably 4 years in a row, where the Eagles have taken multiple firsts and multiple seconds. They also have Harley Reid, which I think does go a long way, to be honest. Hey guys, just a quick note to let you know that this video is brought to you in a paid partnership with BetterHelp. Investing in yourself is important. People will invest time and money into their careers, they'll invest time and money into their fitness, but one aspect of the self that people can tend to overlook is the mind. And something like therapy could be the most underappreciated tool out there that people can use to invest in their mind. It's a common misconception that you need to be diagnosed with something like depression or anxiety to invest in your mental health. Therapy can be a great tool for self-improvement and investing in healthier habits and just talking to somebody about the things that are on your mind. And it's even better when they're a trained mental health professional. It's also really good to know that when you're expressing yourself, you can do so in a safe space without fear of judgment. BetterHelp is the paid partner of this video, and they're on a mission to help make starting therapy easier. It's a platform where therapists and their clients can communicate effectively and get the most out of therapy. And it's really easy to start with BetterHelp. To do this, all you have to do is go to the link in the description of this video or simply go to betterhelp.com/truefooty. From there, you fill out a questionnaire that helps them assess your specific needs. And then in most cases, you're matched with a therapist within 48 hours. Then if you find that the therapist you're matched with doesn't feel like the right fit, you can easily switch to one at no additional cost. So if you're struggling or perhaps you just feel like you could benefit from a therapy session, check out the link in my description or go to betterhelp.com/truefooty. That also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp. Thanks guys, let's get back to the video. What about Carlton in uncertain? I'm just uncertain about this because they're a team that could be contending, but they're a little bit older than Fremantle, right? So there's a chance that they go over the other side by the time Tasmania comes in 2027, let's say. It's that draft we're referring to. They should be fine, to be honest, but you also consider they haven't really been hitting the draft until they took Jagger Smith this year, but that has also come at the cost of plenty of draft picks. So they didn't take a first for a couple of years, if I'm not mistaken. They also won't take a first round up in 2025 unless they do something about that. So again, I'm speculating on what the situation currently is. Obviously, in 12 months, at the 2025 trade period, Carlton could generate another first round draft pick. That would help the situation. But their age profile, having been taking a lot of picks, they're a little bit iffy for me. I've got 3 teams I'm going to fill out in the top section now. North Melbourne should be very well placed for talent. Are they going to be contending? I think there's so many factors that go into that, and they're still, climbing up the ladder. What did they win 3 games in 2024 or 4? I can't remember. Either way, I think it's too early to say they're going to be contending by then. But, no team has had the same access to the draft that North Melbourne has, and some of those young talents are absolutely top tier. So I think they're one of the first cabs off the rank of teams that will be fine with Tasmania, other than the fact that they've got a Tasmanian highly rated talent in Colby McKercher. I'm sure they'll keep him, whatever, that's not the point. Talk about Sydney Swans, another team, and the Brisbane Lions probably. Where are you, Brisbane? Let's talk about these 2 teams. Both of them are in the premiership. We know that actually they played each other in the grand final. Sydney, in particular, not in particular. Both of these teams are extremely well placed for talent. Sydney have 3 likely first rounders in 2025 through their academy. And given the fact that they have a Northern Academy that can be insulated from the risk of Tasmania taking them, I think, under the current rules, unless they change the rules, Sydney should be well placed. Brisbane's academy does not produce the same high level talent that Sydney's does, at least, on the data. And I think in 2025, they have a top 4 or 5 currently ranked academy prospect, but I read that will be the first top 10 Brisbane Lions academy player ever. So it might not have the back history of producing talent, but there is an academy nonetheless. And further to that, 3 gunfather sons in the Ashcroft boys and Jasper Fletcher. So look, they do have the old age profile, but by sheer virtue of their academy, even if Brisbane fall off a cliff, even with the Ashcroft boys doing well, in say 3 years, if Brisbane is struggling, the academy kind of insulates them from that. And they do have some real top level talents in there. So if they get the core part of their list right, they can build, through mature age players around those role players, but they could already have the nucleus of their next team in their next window. The Bulldogs are a team that could either go in likely contending or well placed. Look, they've actually acquired a lot of good quality young talent over the years and added to that again in 2024. But age profile of how good some of their best talents are, Riley Sanders, obviously he's unproven, but Sam Darcy, Jamari Ugle-Hagan, Aaron Norton's still a young guy. I don't think there's any doubt that the Bulldogs are going to, the premiership window is going to fall off a cliff. I suppose there's always a question of what happens to them when Bont leaves, but from a pure talent acquisition point of view, Jordan Crawford's another first rounder they got last year. They have been drafting hard. They've been drafting really effectively. And further to that, I think in 3 years' time, the Bulldogs should be still in that top half of the ladder. So I don't think they're particularly vulnerable at all. Hawthorn probably go in this likely contending thing as well, because they're quite young, but they've become a little bit older now, getting Barras and Battle, and we expect them to be a premiership contender now. And considering how many young players are on that team, they're still exceptionally young for the most part. They're still not going to be particularly vulnerable. They've got a great system, and one of those teams that routinely does well with late draft picks, which we sort of ignore. We should sort of ignore the fact that Hawthorn do well with late draft picks, because we're talking about this from an access to talent point of view. But the team they've already got is really good, and I think in 3 years' time, they're not going to be rebuilding, right? So I think they're very safe. St Kilda, for me, either go in the yellow or the green. I'll probably go yellow, but I do think they could be contending. But, they probably were the furthest off it between them and any of the teams above them there. I honestly think it could go either way. But one thing I will acknowledge with St Kilda that makes them different to Fremantle, for instance, is the fact that they have been spending the last 4 years in a row of hitting the draft hard, and in my opinion, have drafted some great talents in there. Nazaya Wanganeen Millera, Machito Owens, Mateus Philippou, Darcy Wilson, and then this year, Travalia, Taru, and some later picks as well. So they're a team that has been investing in the draft, probably acknowledging that they're going to have one dip at the young talent, start to move up, and by the time Tasmania enter the competition, St Kilda, in theory, should be contending. So I'll leave them in the yellow for now, probably just because, that they probably haven't achieved as much as these teams here. You could say they're line ball with Fremantle, but Fremantle haven't been hitting the draft hard. Like I said, the distinguishing factor for St Kilda here is that they have been hitting the draft. So I do think, in theory, they are pretty well placed. You could probably move them up one, but I think I've said my bit. You get my opinion on St Kilda. Richmond have been hitting the draft. Well, they've just this year. So there's a little bit of doubt with Richmond only because, well, for a start, they've overexposed their list. That's not really by design. A lot of those players wanted to leave anyway. They could not have done better from a value for money point of view. Like the draft picks they got, they absolutely smashed it from a list management point of view. And we saw them take 3 key forwards, 2 midfielders, a forward midfielder in Houghton, and then another forward. So they're building their list from scratch. But it was still like 7 first-round picks this year, and then next year they hold what could be pick 1 and 2. I don't expect North Melbourne to finish second last, but let's just say pick 1 and another top 4 or 5 pick. So they're making up ground quickly. However, compared to some of these other players, like they've obviously proven nothing, as they haven't played a game at AFL level. So it's still probably a very speculative situation. You could probably say uncertain. So if I was going to say St Kilda is probably between these two, I'd say Richmond's between these two. It could go either way by sheer virtue of the fact that we're talking about 18-year-olds who haven't played a game. But, the strategy has been there. And in theory, if they continue to employ that strategy over the next 2 to 3, there's no reason they couldn't have formed the main part of their team. However, it's hard to imagine that they're a good team within 3 years. And if they're not, they're still going to be down the ladder and therefore affected by Tasmania, right? But either way, they've made up a lot of ground. You can't really fault the way they've gone about it in terms of strategy, but I do hold fears for what Richmond's medium-term future looks like. So let's go controversial and put Geelong in uncertain. Okay, so this is from a theoretical point of view. In theory, I'm unsure which way it'll go. They haven't been hitting the draft hard. They've had some access to draft picks, and they've traded in a few guns as well from other clubs, or at least highly rated players like Tanner Bruin. I acknowledge that they're actually pretty young, but in theory, they haven't had a lot of access to the draft. And of course, traded in Bailey Smith. I almost forgot that part. Look, they're probably going to be likely contending. They're one of these other teams as well where it could go either way. And Carlton are probably in the same boat. They could also be likely contending. But you have to say that there's a degree of uncertainty. The difference with Geelong is that they routinely buck the trend or buck the expectation of where people assess them in the premiership window and their list cycle. Like, they just continually are good. And so I will put a massive, big, fat, juicy butt on that I think Geelong is probably going to be deep in September, 3 years from now, and are largely going to be unaffected. However, if we go back to the premise of this and looking at it from a talent acquisition point of view, Geelong aren't necessarily massively well placed, but one thing that sets them apart along with Geelong is their ability to nail late draft picks. So I'm not super concerned for them. But again, if I put them in likely contending, it would just be on a hunch that Geelong will continue to be fine, which isn't particularly analytical. So I've said my bit. I think uncertainty is about right, but deep down, I think Geelong will be completely fine. Now let's talk about Collingwood, who are my one team in the danger zone. This, again, is purely from a list analysis point of view when you consider how old that team is and how little access to the draft they've had in a few years. Obviously, Nick Dacos is still pretty young, so that goes a long way, don't get me wrong. And they could have a future first-round pick next year with Tom McGuan, but is that enough to move the needle on their own? Probably not. Collingwood have a lot of older players, but I'm assessing it right at this current period of time. They've got Dan Houston, they've got Harry Perryman. In 3 years, those guys will be like 29 or 30, and maybe it works out all right. But if we hold the same standard that I said about Geelong against Collingwood, they're in a worse list position. And in theory, ignore who the team is. If you just look at the list, you go, oh shit, in 3 years, this could all blow up. What is different about Collingwood is they're probably going to still attract some top talents. If someone like a Harley Reid does request a trade home from West Coast, my guess is Geelong and Collingwood are going to be the strongest contenders. Because of the appeal that Collingwood have and their ability to manage these situations, I don't actually think Collingwood are going to be screwed in 3 years. However, again, we're just going back to the list position stuff, ignoring who the teams are for a minute and just go on the principles of what makes a good list prepared for Tasmania. Collingwood have the single worst. And yet, in 3 years' time, I don't think they're going to be the basket case that it may seem like I'm saying they are. I stand by that. Collingwood have so many veterans, but what's different about Collingwood is that players just want to play for them. And if they use the free agency market really well and they draft well, everything will be fine. And it's not a prediction, it's based on the principles of this video. The premise, Collingwood do have the worst position. What do we put Essendon? Essendon have been hitting the draft. I think that's fair to suggest. They took Isaac Kako this year, some good picks in the 30s, again, pretty speculative. Took Nate Caddy last year. In 2025, they hold what could be 2 top 10 picks. So whatever you think of Essendon's team, which is relatively mature and has fallen short of finals most years out of the last however many, ignoring again who they are and their reputation, they have been hitting the draft. Now, do I think they'll be likely contending? I think there's still enough doubt about that to not put them in that top category. And to be perfectly honest, I think St Kilda as the team I'm more confident will play finals and be deep into finals 3 years from now. Essendon could go either way. However, I do like the kids that they've drafted. Big fan of Nate Caddy, I did say that. Isaac Kako looks fantastic. 2 top 10 picks. Can't complain about any of that. I don't think Essendon, from a list point of view, will be any more vulnerable than any of these other teams in this category here. It's just about what they do with that talent. From a talent point of view, they should be okay, to be honest. Adelaide Crows, you'd probably put in have been hitting the draft. They only took 1 pick this year. Oh, they took 2. They took Tyler Welsh, but Sid Draper, fantastic talent. Again, we've got to look past just the most recent draft, right? Because they're unproven. But Adelaide's young talent is pretty solid. You also consider, a big, powerful club in South Australia that gives them, a 50-50 chance of luring talent home. Probably should ignore that for the purposes of this. We're just talking about their team, and they have taken high draft picks. Sid Draper is one, Riley Thilthorpe, another one who looks like he's really hitting his straps. Some good, rock-solid young talent. I don't know if I'd back them in to be likely contending. I think Fremantle, Hawthorn, and the Bulldogs are just a little bit further along. Will Adelaide be in finals, though, in 3 years? Probably. They could be in finals in 2025. I'm not too sure about that. But still one of the youngest lists, at least, by the selected teams. I repeated this stat so many times, but it's important to know that Adelaide were incredibly young this year and finished in the bottom 4. Presumably, there is a connective link between those two things. Very young list. They'll be fine when Tassie enters the competition. I'm going to put Melbourne in uncertain, which may or may not surprise because I did a couple of videos on Melbourne and their list position recently. And the premise of the first one was that I felt they were at a bit of a list crossroads, given, at the time there was speculation around Petrarca, Oliver, and Cosy Pickett. And I was like, well, if they jettison these 3 players and get some draft picks, then they're fully on board preparing for Tasmania. As it happens, all 3 players stayed. Melbourne's young talent is pretty good. If you look at their under 21 talent in terms of who they recruited, they took Caleb Windsor and Colton Tholstrup in the top 12 or 13 picks last year. Judd McVie, Cosy Pickett is still a young man. Trent Rivers. So from that point of view, they're pretty sweet. And they took Harvey Langford and Xavier Lindsay this year. So look, they're pretty sweet. I guess the main doubt is how many of those midfielders they pick come good. And maybe that's the part I'm uncertain about. I really like Xavier Lindsay, but you also factor in the lack of first rounder next year is a product of them getting Xavier Lindsay this year. So it could probably go either way. It could be really well timed or really badly timed for Melbourne in 3 years. I'm really not too sure. And one thing that could be a catalyst for this, and in a positive way, is if we're sitting here in 12 months and Cozzy Pickett, Clayton Oliver and Petrarca potentially leave, or at least some sort of combination of those three players, it allows them to get a head start in terms of acquiring picks before Tasmania. They've made a good start. There is a good young core. They've invested in the draft, albeit it has come at the cost of next year's first. They do have an aging list that could go either way. And so I'm uncertain. I do praise their strategy. I think they've done really hard to improve the young talent on the list for a few years now, but I'm not sure if it's enough in comparison to the teams above them. GWS is also uncertain for me. When you consider that their list profile is quite old in terms of who their best players are and how much they rely on them, those older midfielders and Jesse Hogan, they do have some really good players right in the right age bracket, and there's some young talent there. I suppose what's uncertain about GWS is, look, they've had heaps of access to the draft. They've actually done a really good job of compiling picks and obviously lost some players to free agency this year, which gave them more picks. I suppose the uncertainty of it is just that some of the players they picked were quite unconventional picks. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that their picks were bad, but I was barely aware Cody Ango, for a start, was a player in this year's draft when he was selected by them. So they've been ballsy. And considering, if they didn't have such an older group of veterans in that team that play really well week to week and lift them, and I include Jesse Hogan, who will be 30 next year, if there is some degree of vulnerability and an unprovenness with both the young talent on their list currently, aside from Tom Green naturally, and maybe Finn Callaghan, but even he's unproven. If there was more evidence to suggest the draft picks they've been having lately were hitting, I'd probably put them higher, but uncertain for me. I'm not 100% sure, but they are a pretty well-run club. They'll probably be fine. Port Adelaide I actually might put in likely contending. I think this is an unpopular take because I think there is some pessimism, both from Port fans that I've read and general negativity about them. And it's probably, always in light of their recent finals performances. But look, list profile-wise, Port Adelaide are pretty sweet. Rosie, Butters, Jason Horne-Francis. When you consider that nucleus is probably going to be as good as any other core midfield group in the competition. Sure, it does rely on what they do around that, how they can support those players. They did just take Joe Barry in this year's draft. They did just lose Dan Houston. They got Jack Lukosius. There's a lot of moving parts here with Port Adelaide, but I don't really see any real reason why they shouldn't be a good team 3 or 4 years from now. I still think Rosie, Butters, and Horne-Francis will be their prime, and Horne-Francis could be one of the best players in the competition. I don't think Port Adelaide are in a bad spot at all. I think they're likely contending in 3 or 4 years. Will they actually win the cup? I have no idea, but I don't see the vulnerability with Port Adelaide. I think they're still in a good list position. It's just about climbing over that final hurdle to win the whole damn thing, or at least make a grand final. Naturally, I could read that wrong, and they might have the best nucleus of 3 gun midfielders in the competition, and if everything collapses around that, maybe they'll be vulnerable, but I just think that's pretty unlikely. I think there's enough decent talent around the ground with Port Adelaide that is not particularly old, where they should be fine. However, if one of those players leaves, that does change things. But there you have it, guys. That is my take on the teams and how well they're placed for Tasmania's entry into the competition. Bearing in mind, this is all very theoretical, and it might look different in 12 months' time when different teams make moves. And it's also not really a prediction because I'm not predicting that's going to be the ladder in 3 or 4 years from now, but it's just a general reflection of the list positions that I believe that these teams are in, and I'd imagine there's a lot of disagreement across the board. So let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.